turn the meeting over to Tom. Tom, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Thank you all for coming and welcome to this session of Great Decisions that will be set up here technically. That those of you who've become accustomed to seeing me sitting here on a wide range of topics have reason to wonder how I can pretend to know about as many different subjects as I do. The answer is in part that I set out in my career to make my niche, my slice of reality, how all the pieces fit together. That I do have done some work on individual pieces of international security, international politics, international system, policymaking, and so forth. But my real interest and focus has been on how developments in national security, nuclear issues, climate change, economics, geopolitics, demography fit together. They're all part of the same web complex of international relations that I actually have done a fair amount of work on climate change. And I want to begin in a way that I don't normally do so, just with a story, maybe even a parable about climate change and work on climate change, international cooperation. It is also the story of how I got pulled into working on this subject 20 years ago. That Senator Dianne Feinstein and I knew one another for many years before she went to Washington. I was introduced to her at an event in San Francisco, something that I consider quite notable. I was introduced to Dianne Feinstein by Shirley Temple Black, who used to attend arms control seminars at Stanford, which I was a part. And Senator Feinstein, being a politician, kind of remembered the connection. We did things before each of us went to Washington. And she played that as we had a special relationship. She could ask me things. She could ask me to do things. And climate change is in that category. That 2006, I guess it was, she called up and said, I want you to do some work on climate change. Climate change was not very widely recognized, not well understood. At the time, there was one UN International Climate Change Panel, International Panel on Climate Change report that was very much of a first effort on it. And it became clear in our conversation that she wanted a US government assessment of climate change. That's relevant as the talk this evening unfolds because of reluctance, particularly within the legislative branch, to accept any non-American judgment about issues that could affect the United States, US budgets, US deployment of human capital, and so forth. So that I won't rehearse the entire discussion, which went over a period of weeks with, I want you to do this. I don't know anything. Yeah, but I trust you. Trust is nice and I appreciate that, but I still don't know anything about climate change. And more importantly, at the time I was the chair of the National Intelligence Council. We, the intelligence community, doesn't know anything about this. We don't bug Mother Nature's telephone. This is not something that we have expertise. So in going back and forth on this, it became clear. She really wanted something done on what she considered an important issue. She also wanted a stick to whack the Republican administration which in her judgment was not taking climate change seriously. So from the get-go, it was affected by the phenomenon of American distrust of expertise that's not our own. Now it's morphed into distrust of all expertise. The other was the partisan politics aspect of it. And she was trading on, in part, my own personal reputation, but in part the objectivity of the intelligence community. In the course of going back and forth to find something we could do, I said, why don't you assign this to NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration? They do this stuff. Why don't you assign this to the National Academy of Sciences? You got people who understand this. And the response was instantly understandable to somebody that spent as much time in Washington as I had. I don't sit on their committees. I do sit on your committee. I can make you do it. Okay, no point arguing that anymore. So it became a, how do we define the task that was within the bounds of what our expertise was? And we hit upon the geopolitical implications of climate change, not the rate at which sea levels would rise, not what needed to be done to reduce carbon footprints of particular industries, but it's happening. How is it going to affect different parts of the world? Nobody done that. So we took it on. We had to invent methodology to get at it. And I won't go through the entire drill on that tonight, but I do want to point out a couple of things because they're relevant to the chapter in the Great Decisions Workbook for those who have or will read it, and to the remarks I will make later. That how far out did we look? At that time, virtually everything that was sort of out there from the realm of mostly university-based research or done under the auspices of the United Nations was looking at 50 years, 75 years, 100 years. I thought that was interesting, but I'm a political scientist, and the realm that we're holding politics constant for 75 years makes no sense at all. Holding politics constant for 5 years is a problem. It's a big assumption to be worked with. So if we're going to look at the impact on Bolivia or Malawi or Vietnam, what assumptions were we making about the capacity of different systems to deal with the problems? So we said, we will accept the medium of the 3 UN projections. We'll assume that's right, or close enough to being authoritative that we're not going to fiddle around with it. We said, if that's right, what's going to be the impact on it? And we decided to go out to 2030. 2006, 2007 has probably made that decision to go out there. And the reason we picked 2030 was two. One is how much can you hold constant that to stay within the bounds of the, but the other was that the folks who had worked on climate change were in complete agreement on one dimension of it. And that was, there was nothing that could be done that would change what is going to happen to climate between 2007 and 2030. That die had already been cast. If we reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gases more generally, we manage its slow rates of growth, and so the consequence, the effects of that were after 2030. So whatever was going to happen in that time period we looked at was going to happen. So focusing on how do you deal with it, not is it going to happen or not, which was very different than had been done by anybody at the time. There are many complications of that. We had all the projections that, I'll just pick the number of 50 years out. How much temperature would change, how much sea level would rise, how precipitation amounts would be affected, and other things. I said, well, as a first approximation, let's say that it's going to be a smooth progression, that over the 50-year, 70-year, 100-year, it's going to increase by a fixed percentage per year. No basis for that other than convenience. I said, assume again that the places that were used to illustrate dramatic effects were dramatic effects, and that the places that were going to be in most trouble 50 years now, we're going to be in relative terms in most trouble in 15 years. The amount of impact would be smaller, but it's going to be in the same places that were predicted. And looking at the South Pacific Islands, looking at the southeast coast of the United States, that whatever the projection was, we're going to have a percentage of it in there. And elected to go after information that, for example, if sea level goes up 1/3 of a meter over that period, which within the bounds of what was being predicted, how many people are affected in different places? Ought to be relatively simple to figure that out. Look at the isobars on a map. That how many people live within the isobars that will be affected? First thing we discovered, the lines are too far apart. The magnitude of change that we were expecting to see or projecting to see within our 15 years, the lines were too far apart. You couldn't actually, so poking around discovered by 2006, virtually every map in the world was based on a single space shuttle mission, which mapped 85% of the surface of the Earth more accurately than it had ever been mapped before. US government made all of that information available. Everybody used it to make better maps. My response to that was, it's our data. Reprocess it, put the lines closer together. We own it, and we're making it available to everybody. We ran into something similar with census tracts. They were simply too big. The UN census framework used by most countries was developed by the Commerce Department of the United States. It's one of those things that we do as service to the international community. Nobody calls attention to it because that would taint it. It would be, American fiddling with it. But here it is as a free good made available. Let's get it changed. So we got judgments about places that would be affected, and then we made a different set of judgments. As we're looking at geopolitical, the first one, which countries are likely to be capable of managing this magnitude of impact? They've got a political system that's competent to manage problems, allocate resources. They've got technical talent that can wrestle with the problems. They've got the money to throw at the problem. So an extreme example was the Netherlands. The Netherlands knows how to manage water. I've been doing it for hundreds of years. They're rich enough, they got the, we put them on, we're not gonna worry about these guys. And we had a bunch of the highly developed countries. They said they're gonna have problems, but they can manage them. On the other end, we had countries that you say, it's hopeless. mostly this is islands in the South Pacific. They're going to be underwater. There's no place to move to. All the money in the world in engineering talent is not going to be enough to save a country that is less than 2 meters in elevation for these. So we took another category and said, we're not going to worry about them because the US can't do anything except maybe fly people out. But we had a whole bunch of countries in the middle. So we had to make judgments about governmental capacity, technical capacity, economic capacity, and the like. And we did that in a way using a Delphi system. Bunch of experts on particular parts of Africa or South America or South Asia. And we asked them the same questions. And we kind of aggregated their responses and took what seemed to be the prevailing judgment about this. And that produced a first ever report of its kind that ended up having a tremendous impact outside of the US government because of the methodologies, because we identified the things that we would have to know in order to do long-term planning, in order to have policies that would respond nationally or internationally. And they had to be presented in a way that they'd be accepted, not the Americans say this is what's going to happen on it. So the methodological implications, it didn't have any impact in the US government. We had structured it in a way that was completely unclassified, everything we used, but I made it classified. I put a confidential classification on. I had classification authority. And the reason was to give American politicians time to figure out how they wanted to make judgments about what do you do with this. That I wanted to delay the starting gun for foreign governments coming in and saying, you've determined that we're going to have a big problem, we need some help. Or the hyphenate American community weighing in, or the militaries weighing in, that to figure out things, do you help the places that are going to experience problems first and use up a lot of resources with that? Do you wait and do it for the countries that have the most people? Or the magnitude of the impact on particular sectors or industries? Or the migration implications? You're going to have a lot of people fleeing climate-generated conditions and destabilizing the places they go to. So we laid out those kind of considerations and said, you figure it out. You got 15 years to figure out how you want to do this. Absolutely nothing was done. That my testimony on this in 2008 remains the only testimony on the subject by a serving US government official. The stick to whack Republicans, Democrats using that stick against the Republicans, and the Republicans using the same stick to whack Democrats. Democrats, Republicans, you ignore this global problem, and they still ignore it. It's described as a hoax. The Republican response was to condemn the Democrats for commissioning this report and diverting resources that should have been used for the global war on terror. That we had elevated a non-issue to greater importance than a critical threat. And that fight goes on to this day. That's all by way of background that I hope will make easier to understand what I'm going to say about US views of international cooperation in general, the importance of it to deal with climate change, and how it is affected by both the passage of time and the specific policies of our current administration. So, a couple words on the article for those who have or will read it by Joshua Busby. I think it's a pretty good article. And among the reasons I think it's a good article is it does not beat the same climate change is coming, climate change is here, climate change is dangerous, that people have heard that and they've either accepted it or rejected it, but he doesn't do that. And the starting point, this is a here and now problem, which it is consistent with the predictions we made in 2007 and 8 when we did our study. But his focus is on how are we going to manage it? What are we going to do about it? And since it's a global problem, it affects everybody in some way, directly or indirectly. How do you get buy-in for something that most of those affected don't have capacity to do very much? But if you're going to have a kind of a democratic, all-inclusive approach to tackling the problems, they're not bringing much to the party except the magnitude of the problem. They're not bringing financial resources. They're not bringing technical resources. They're not making the trade-offs in national security budgets and the like, but they're entitled, certainly in theory, to a say in how you manage the problem. His article is very rich in detail, too much probably for most readers, but it makes 4 key points, and I think they're all both accurate and important. The first is that all countries, all people have a stake in how we collectively respond to the challenges of climate change. You can't sit this one out. I'm on the high ground, doesn't matter to me in some respect. The second is that international cooperation is necessary to deal effectively with these challenges, but it's really hard to achieve. It's not a simple, everybody's affected, everybody ought to understand that they're affected, and they ought to willingly pool resources, put their heads together and tackle the problems. Even if you can get past my problem is more important than your problem, so I ought to come first, or I ought to get more in this. There is you can't do everything at once. So you start one place and somebody else has to wait. And I'll illustrate this with not a climate change, but a man-made engineering example. When I was in college, I worked a couple of summers as a surveying aide for County Public Works Department in Long Island. And somebody decided that we needed jetties to save the Fire Island beaches and the far eastern end of Long Island beaches. And the Corps of Engineers came up with something that had, I don't know, 20, 22 jetties was what it said was necessary. And of course, the response was, we don't have money for 22 jetties. We'll build 9. Where do you put the 9? It should not come as a surprise to anybody that knows sort of where wealth is on Long Island. We started with the Hamptons. Not many people, but very rich people in the Hamptons. So we started putting the jetties in there. And by the time a jetty was about 3/4 in, dumping big rocks to make these things, by the time it was about 3/4 in, it really started to change the pattern that the water moved, slowed it down, and it dropped a lot of sand. And literally, it was the case, we'd go home on Friday, come back on Monday, and it had added 25, 30 feet of beach, 5 feet deep. It was just incredible. Where did the sand come from? The public beaches that were further west. which today are a quarter of a mile less wide than they used to be because they never got around to appropriating the money to build the rest of the jetties. That's an illustration of what will happen in responding to climate change. I do something to protect San Francisco Airport. We don't want our airport going underwater. What happens to Foster City when the water that would have gone across the airport is now diverted? It's going to go someplace. And how do you do that without kind of master plans, comprehensive thinking about it? Or we have a special friend, another country that is an ally, and we're going to help them with their response to the problem. What about the places that are on either side of them? And how do you coordinate that? The third point he makes, the crisis is accelerating, that it's here now and it's getting worse at an accelerating pace. But developments around the globe make it increasingly difficult to get international cooperation. That we don't agree on how to handle Gaza. We don't agree on what to do, if anything, about the civil war in Sudan. We don't agree on how to manage the inequities in the global trading system or water shortage problems in there. As a whole range of other things are becoming more complicated, if not worse, it competes with doing something on climate change. And that's a point he makes, I think, correctly. The final one is the US role is critically important. Not just because we arrogantly think we're the most important and indispensable place in the world, but on this, we come pretty close. The need for leadership, the need or the ability to bring people together to do stuff that they would just as soon not do. And you have to bang some heads as well as throw money at the problem. And the US role is waning, is diminishing. We're less willing, we're less able to play a leading role than we were 10 years ago. And the trend line is in the wrong direction. So my talk is going to emphasize these same 4 points. I'm going to provide less detail and more context. And hopefully in that sense, it's a complement to the chapter. I've divided the talk into a segment on international organizing, mobilizing international efforts to deal with the effects of climate change, the history of US attitudes towards international treaty-based or non-treaty-based efforts to manage complex problems, a little bit on geopolitical realities, and then finally, the US role and what are the implications of the withdrawal from the Paris Treaty, for example, are. But let me turn to the mobilizing international efforts. Serious attempt to organize the world on this problem, as opposed to all of the other problems that require global attention, begins in 1992. It's fairly recent in the sweep of history, a long time ago. And that's before half our population was born. So it's either a long time ago and should have been solved, or understandably we haven't figured this out yet because it's complicated. That 92 effort is called the UN Framework on Climate Change. It was based on the projections of a 1988, a preliminary UN effort to identify whether global Atmospheric conditions were changing. Is climate changing? If so, how's it changing? How fast? Not much was known. A lot known about the weather, not much known about climate and its dynamics. 5 years later, there's the first of the big marquee, the Kyoto Protocol on dealing with climate change. That countries committed to a very limited agenda. They committed to provide data on greenhouse gases and a few other things, but it wasn't a commitment to change anything. It wasn't a commitment to organize particular activities. It's the first thing we need is better data. So we'll provide it. And that wrestle with the question of, well, we all have a common stake, but we don't all have the same responsibility for dealing with this. And that opened up another can of worms. Well, the developed countries, the rich countries, North America and Europe, that industrialized first, that put the bulk of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are most responsible for the conditions that bring about climate change. Therefore, we have primary responsibility for cleaning up our mess. Okay, there's a certain point to it. Among the derivative questions that come from that, how do we act on this responsibility? Do we spend money cleaning up our power plants, shifting from coal to gas, dealing with the continued propagation of gases that worsen? Or do we use that money to enable poorer countries to modernize their economies in ways that don't repeat the same mistakes? It is an either-or proposition because there's not enough money. There's not enough engineers. There's not enough anything to do all of this stuff. But who pays? Who goes first and who waits? How much should development in poor countries be retarded in order to accelerate the fight against global warming? Just to use one dimension of it. Countries made pledges to reduce emissions. They varied. Countries are going to be down to 50% of what emissions were in 1990, or 70% of what emissions were at some other. They're all over the map, but they're voluntary commitments, non-binding. Getting binding commitments in an international arena, the people involved in this, that's too hard. That's much too hard. So invoke kind of moral authority. Do you want to be the one that is the laggard on this? Can't you have a one-upmanship arrangement? And the theory was, if you make people report what they're doing, and you get them to make at least a best efforts pledge, they'll try harder to do it. And trying harder is better than not trying at all. Even though this protocol, this convention, which was crafted in the form of a treaty that countries signed and took back for ratification, the US signed it, but we've never ratified it. Congress was vehemently opposed to ratifying this agreement, and the opposition was cast as it will slow or cripple US economic development and performance. We cannot, as a country, shackle ourselves for the good of the world in ways that makes it not to the good of the American people. There have been subsequent meetings every year since. The same countries, which is basically everybody. It is usually, give or take, 190 countries show up for these meetings. The most recent of which was in Azerbaijan, just a matter of months ago on it. And they pushed the ball forward a little bit. But the major divisions have been between the developed world and the developing world. And the question, who pays? Until 2015, this was essentially an irresolvable problem. But in 2015, Barack Obama and Xi Jinping, at a bilateral meeting in Beijing, committed themselves to cooperation, to find a viable way to square the circle on the developed versus developing. It was one of many commitments from Chinese leaders to American leaders that they didn't follow up on. Obama didn't let go of it. He went to Paris. And if there were more time, it's actually quite an interesting story. He basically grabbed the Chinese delegation, yanked them into a room, and wouldn't let them leave until they had committed to accept limits on developing country production, in exchange for Obama's commitment that he's going to organize the rich countries to create a pot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars to do this. Paris was a dramatic advance from Kyoto in terms of the specificity of the commitments made. It didn't solve it, but we made a commitment. Initial commitment was $3 billion of a $100 billion total that we would contribute by 2020. In subsequent years, the size of the projected pot has gone up. U.S. best efforts pledge has gone up until the Trump administration. I don't know where that is now. The reluctance of the U.S. to sign, adhere to these kind of international agreements. I'll come in a minute. They're long-standing. Mr. Trump, in his first term, addressed the problem by withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. He took the U.S. out. As a practical matter, then, it didn't have much significance. It's kind of U.S. abandonment of a leading role in the fight against the effects of climate change. So we lost moral authority, but didn't change much. The reason it didn't change much was because by the 2017, when he announced withdrawal, changes were already underway, mostly in the private sector, because of changes in the price of natural gas, because of changes in the relative cost of coal, because of the fuel efficiency standards, that changes were underway, that industries were not going to go backwards. And reputational motivations to be able to say, we're cleaner, we're greener, we're doing the right thing, and whatever it is, they're there, and they're now baked into the system. So withdrawing from the convention had a political impact, but not a practical impact. You may well remember, Joe Biden is elected 2020, 2021, day one, he returns the U.S. to the Paris commitment. 2025, day one of the Trump administration, he withdraws. what had happened in the intervening years was the expectations for U.S. leadership had first gone up and then crashed mightily. So it looks, what's going on is like, basically it's selfish America. We're cleaning up our act, and we're beginning to allocate money in the Biden policies were passed to manage the effects of climate change. Were we going to test bed them and transfer them to others? It now does not look like it. That somebody has to take the lead within the US political system. Let me shift to multilateral agreements, the history of American dislike for these, which frankly I find quite baffling. But the ambivalence about these commitments is truly striking since World War II. Because the post-World War II system was by and large designed by, built by, maintained by the United States. The reluctance to lock in elements of the rules-based international order, locking others into it as well as locking ourselves into it, I find baffling. But a steadily decreasing percentage of what we do internationally is embedded in treaties, in formal international agreements. They're all sort of coalition of the willing. We'll do it because we've decided to do it, but it doesn't have the firmness, the certainty that a treaty does. Why does that matter? It matters for all of the other countries, that for them to invest the time, the effort, the political capital, the money into doing things, they need to be able to point to something. This is a part of our international commitments. Other countries are locked in and committed to do this as well. If we opt out of it, others will opt out of it, and we will be worse off. It's far more necessary for other countries to have that kind of international underpinning, justification for, I got to allocate less money to education and healthcare because I got to meet my commitments under climate change there. And with the US opting out of it, the air goes out of the balloon. It's not unusual for big countries to want to stay out of international agreements. If you're the big guy, you can do whatever you want to do. Why would you voluntarily be Gulliver laying down and letting the Lilliputians tie you down with their strings? That the US has been unique in history over the last 70 years. The extent to which we voluntarily have entered into agreements that constrain our freedom of action because we have judged that we're better off for accepting those constraints if others abide by those same constraints. And most of the time, we have, not all the time, but most of the time, we've abided by the rules and the commitments that we have helped to formulate. But it goes against history. That I remind you of Woodrow Wilson's experience after World War I, formation of the League of Nations. Could not get the US Congress to approve membership for the United Nations. So the key pillar of that international system was to be us. Could not get it through Congress. Every administration since World War II has pressed for congressional ratification of now a declining number of international agreements. One of the clear, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We're the only significant country that has not ratified it. We're not a member. We state, we abide by all of the commitments, but we're not formally obligated to do so. As one of the largest trading nations, one of the largest navies in the world, largest sea coast, we've got Rio stakes, but can't get it through. Every Secretary of Defense, every Secretary of State has pressed for this unsuccessfully. How silly this is in some respects. We and North Korea and somebody else, I can't remember, have not ratified the UN Convention on the Protection of Children. It would be an interference with the rights of American families to impose limits on child labor. And you go, that's been lost since early in the 20th century. Even more ridiculous is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Disabled. It is the Americans with Disabilities Act, rammed through by Senator Dole. It's the same words as American law, but nope, we're not going to be bound by this. So there's a certain silliness that has taken on a, do you really want to spend the political capital to be the first one to break with now this long-standing tradition of staying outside of international conventions that are constraining? That plays out in lots of areas. It plays out really significantly in the response to climate change. On climate change, you say, okay, there are at least some identifiable political reasons. You have some very powerful political actors. The oil and gas industry, the coal industry, power plants. They contribute a lot of money to political campaigns. They have a lot of clout. A lot of jobs are at stake. So I don't mean to demean their importance, but their opposition to the existence of climate change, and then to the effects of climate change, has thwarted research. It's thwarted building more resilience into our rebuilding of our infrastructure, which we neglected for decades. We're still running on Eisenhower era, infrastructure that political courage lacking, other priorities taking precedence. Climate change, is it a hoax? Is it real? Is inseparable from the larger loss of confidence in science. Why should I believe what scientists tell us? It worsened the response to COVID-19. In part because doctors, scientists didn't know what they had, fumbling at the beginning, trying to figure out that's the way science works. But my conspiracy theory is as good as your lab results attitude that we now have to deal with. A huge chunk of our school systems that treat creationism as of equal validity with the scientific method. And there's a place for the Bible and there's a place for science, and they overlap at sometimes. But we've set it up as you can't believe in both of these things at the same time. The political debate on dealing with climate change. Underscore the point made earlier. Companies and other organizations, for profit reasons, sound economic reasons, conscience reasons, are more and more doing the right thing if right is measured against managing climate change and managing the effects. But one of the climate study groups that I got put on because of the study I led in 2008 was our national academies, science, engineering, and medicine. And we looked at the factors that contributed the most to the vulnerabilities that we have in our system to the effects of climate change. That we have not hardened, we haven't done very much to build in resilience. Know what we concluded? The number one cause of vulnerability was US policy. Things like cheap flood insurance along the coastal regions of the East Coast. So a hurricane comes, it wipes out a house, people have cheap flood insurance, they put another house where it's going to wash out again. And analogs of that in farming communities, and management of a whole, it was sort of, seemed like the right idea at the time to make people whole if they are damaged by natural disasters. Building homes in the national forests in California. You say, should we be building homes in forests irrespective of the effects of climate change? Is this a good idea? And to insure them with federal or state monies, it's the kind thing to do. Is it the smart thing to do? So building codes of all kinds, real estate codes of all kinds, insurance regulations, and the things the insurance industry decides are too risky. Having that taken on by governments. You say, is that smart? That the guys that do risk for a living say it's too dangerous, so we'll put it on the taxpayers? So we're part of the problem. It's another pogo problem here. That we are moving, we, the United States, are moving in the right direction at an accelerating pace, not because of policy, but because of, again, the actors in our systems, most of whom are private sector, and the demands of consumers, what they insist on. Let me shift to geopolitical dimensions. Geopolitics affects everything. That those of you who remember last year's Great Decision series, there was one article that somewhere between speculated and posited that technology rivalry between the United States and China was going to impede the diffusion of the technologies needed to combat the effects of climate change. Not a crazy idea, but a too narrow look at the problem in there. The biggest geopolitical impact, in my view, is all the other stuff that's going on. And the limited capacity of any government to manage more than a few big problems at the same time. That it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of political capital, it takes a lot of real money. And having sat for years in White House meetings where policy would be debated, the last question in every session, one way or another, was the guy from the OMB, Organization Management and Budget. How are you going to pay for it? Great idea. How are you going to pay for it? And if that affects us, the richest country ever, think of the impact on everybody else, including lots of folks with a different set of priorities around their problems. And doing it for the good of the larger international order has difficulty trumping, if I don't do more to create jobs for my young people, I'm going to be out of office, either by election or discussion. Which we need to do. It's a lofty goal, it's a necessary step. But the reason I started out with that little parable about the 2008 analysis, took it out to 2030. 2030 is 5 years from now. And one thing we've learned in the intervening period is the projections that we made were overly optimistic. Things are happening faster than anybody anticipated that they would happen. One concrete illustration as a side aspect of the work on climate change. Under another of my hats, I headed the 2008 Global Trends study that the US government does every 4 years. And in order to get people to focus on the interactive effects, we put in some scenarios. And one we called October Surprise. And the October Surprise was a massive hurricane that hits New York City. That was Superstorm Sandy. In 2008, we said this could happen within the next 15 years, out in that 10 to 15 years. It happened in 4. It turned out to be distressingly prescient. The flooding of the subways, the flooding of data centers that knocked Wall Street out, the consequences for the oldest housing in the city. And stuff has begun to be done. But it's moving so fast, the costs keep going up, and the default setting says, oh, if we don't know exactly what to do, we don't want to waste any money, so we won't do anything. That's the world we live in. And there were so many competing demands for attention. Rebuilding our military after 20 years of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. Absolutely need to do it. Need to do it for international arms race kind of reasons as well. But let me, again, reaching to the headlines. Mr. Trump's erosion of European confidence in the American security guarantees, the nuclear umbrella that will be there on NATO, the decisions that they have made to significantly increase the amount of money they devote to defense. That means less money to address climate change. It means less money to address other things, but funding their healthcare system is going to take priority over funding response to climate change in West Africa, for example. And among the things that one of my National Academy panels discovered, I think we all knew it was the case, that who's affected first, wherever it is? It's the poor. Why does it affect the poor? Where do they live? Rich people live on the top of the hill. Poor people are squatters living in the floodplain. They're there illegally. Because they're there illegally, they don't have any political representation in there. Who's going to spend money to protect people who shouldn't be there anyway. And it's so completely obvious when you look at it and say, how do you make an argument that it's the right thing to do? And part of the way it's necessary to make the argument, yeah, they're living in the floodplain. But the sea level rise that's going to increase, or the storm surge problem that's going to be there, it's not just wiping out their cardboard and tin shelters. It's contaminating the water supply. It's disrupting spawning ground for the fish industry. That you get saltwater intrusion into water that's used for agriculture. That every city in the world is built on either a river or an ocean for transportation reasons, going all the way back in ancient times and now. 85% of all freight still moves on ships because it's so much cheaper. So that's where all the people are. So these immediate effects of climate change are going to affect a lot of people very quickly. That without international agreements, people won't act. It takes that extra prod to do it. We know this is painful, but we have to do it because we've made the reputation of our country, our ability to attract grants from richer countries, to get even commercial loans if we're not seen to be protecting the infrastructure that we have here. There's a cascade of effects that come into place that argue for doing this. Somebody has to lead it. And one of the things that we've learned, though, one can be idealistic about the United Nations and what it should be doing, its potential. It's not there yet. That it's almost a sure recipe for paralysis. And if you go out, pick a random 193 of your friends and try and get them to decide on anything. That's the United Nations. That people pursue their own interests within this. People are very conscious of when they go home, you don't want to explain, well, that guy got more money than we did. How did you let that happen in there? So the existing bodies don't do it. The need for a special purpose activity, the convention, climate Paris agreement, Paris Accord, or the Kyoto Accord, it's sort of adequate. But as I think I said in the session on the United States and China, as long as we are being perceived by other countries as in an uncontrolled rivalry, they're not going to commit resources and efforts, political support, to efforts to tackle the climate change problems if they think that either US or China is going to pull the rug out from under them. We don't have to be in agreement. We just have to be not even on the same page, but we do have to be in the same book in framing the issues, in prioritizing where to go, what to do first, sharing the burden, bringing in other players in it to demonstrate that this is a collective problem. We can lead a collective solution. And let me use that to transition to the last. The default setting, in my experience, observation, in the United States system, is for the Americans to do it. And the rest of the world kind of assumes we'll step up and do it. We'll put the money at it. We'll put the engineering talent. We'll put the organizational talent. We'll do the training for it. And that's a good thing. It's been a good thing to do it. But the American public is saying, why are we still the only one stepping up? There's lots of other players that now have plenty of resources and talent, and we help make them more prosperous and more able. Why aren't they? Part of it's inertia, part of it's laziness, part of it is nobody will step up as long as we can be assumed to stepping in. And Obama tried to step back in Libya, other places too, but in Libya, said the Europeans wanted this to happen, let them step up, and they didn't do it. They couldn't do it, not for political or moral reasons. It required military capabilities that they don't have. So they didn't commit the non-existent military committee, so they didn't have the political weight behind what they wanted to do, and eventually we struck a deal, and we came in on it. The withdrawal from Paris, now the second time, Paris commitment. The first time, that's an anomaly, okay? The Americans will come to their senses and come back. We voted him out of office, we voted him back in office. It's pretty hard to argue that he doesn't represent a very strong line of thinking in the United States on everything from science to the effects of climate change, which he's called a hoax, and not going to waste any money on that, and cutting the scientific research budgets of stuff that goes after specific kind of consequences or manifestations. It doesn't have to heat up very much more than baseline. It doesn't have to get up to the goal of not getting there. We're there now. And things like disease-bearing insects spread north. It's warmer. They go further. They carry more diseases further than they ever went before. It doesn't take much of an intrusion of salt water into coastal water tables. You know, bad storm surge dumps it in, it goes down, gets in the aquifer. You can't grow stuff because we haven't done the kind of research to develop salt-resistant rice strands, for example. That there are so many dimensions where you say over the long haul, animals and plants would evolve. They're not going to evolve in a decade. You know, stuff over generations of animals or plants. And they're going to respond to this? How is that going to happen? And what is the impact of a couple of degrees difference? I got it. Couple of degrees difference on how fish breed. And fish account for a huge percentage of the protein consumed in the world, particularly the developing world. What are we doing to reduce the vulnerabilities, increase the resilience of where we build stuff? That, again, is a part of the doing the 2008 report. What's the vulnerability of power plants on the Atlantic coast of the United States? That'd drive it home. We're not talking about some distant country. I've forgotten the precise number, but the order of magnitude is 3 dozen, a third of which were nuclear plants that will be affected by a little bit of sea level rise, by storm surges now. And I was at an Army War College program not that long ago on dealing with these effects are already there. And the speaker was talking about this is going to happen, this is going to be there. And the guy from the Navy said, the future is now. every major storm that comes through Newport News, Virginia, floods the parking lots. Doesn't disrupt the shift. Nobody can come to work because there's no place to park. So it shuts us down for 2 or 3 days. We kind of hope we don't go to war during the time when the parking lot is underwater on there. Take that example and multiply it times every natural disaster that one can imagine for a particular part of the country, every industry that could be affected by it. And I'll close with the example of hard drives. Flooding in Thailand in the late 90s knocked out 90% of the hard drive production for the world. It was a simple production chain here. It made a lot of sense to group it, everybody put them there, and they all got flooded out. And the price of hard drives, when you could get them, went through the roof, and it was more than a year to recover from that. That's one example. We can multiply it by as many industries and sectors as you can think of because of the interdependence of the global economy now. The Busby article, that it concludes with a rather distressed note. It's before he knew what the Trump administration would do, but that we are perceived as having lost our will to lead. We're perceived as having turned inward in ways that makes us an unreliable and therefore ineffective organizer of international activity to deal not just with the climate change, all problems that compete for attention. So this is one where the problem is global. The solution to it has, in some respect, has got to start here at home. Let me stop and open up. I went 4 minutes longer than I'd planned to go before questions. But are there any questions in here before we go to Lou? Yes, sir. Sorry, I don't know your name. There's a microphone coming so the people online can hear you.
Yeah, good. Yes, good evening. My name is Michael, and I've traveled in the last 5 years, and I saw things in certain countries, and I'll say that so far America's got some good stuff, like the way they deal with recycling. It's a simple thing, and I didn't want to look down on those countries, but I felt like maybe they didn't know, or maybe it's educational. And your comment about the U.S. policies, I did remember a book by a scientist named Buckminster Fuller,
Oh, yeah.
and he called it lawyer-run capitalism, and how policies will get in the way. We kind of forget what are we paying for after a while, and that just keeps going up and up and up, and all these amendments and things. So just wanted to see how what you thought about where development is and how the difference of development and colonization in some countries. I don't know if one is a pro or a con or something to that
Well,
effect. Yeah. Thank you.
Lou, could everybody hear that question?
I think it'd be great if you could repeat it, please, Tom.
Okay, the question has to do with development of procedures in the United States that are not found in a lot of countries that, my words, not yours, most of which were colonized. That until the 1960s, they were colonies of one of the European imperial powers. That colonization clearly has had a lasting negative impact on education, on healthcare, that it's hard to get started. It's been compounded by bad governance, bad procedures, and then further complicated by the we're rich, we're more stable, we know better than you do how you should allocate your resources, and people resent it for understandable reasons. They rather make their own mistakes than be told what to do by another outsider. And a lot of the kinds of programs that were undertaken by USAID, for example, that aim to get rid of basic level stuff involving local people. That are they efficient? No, they're not efficient. Because they're not using highly skilled people. And part of it is you're trying to train people. You're trying to convey basic sanitation skills. To have safe drinking water, which has downstream benefits on health. Improving agricultural practices, not as much fertilizer, all of these kind of things. The double-edged character of experience gained in the more highly developed part of the world that can be beneficial, but presenting it in a way that is not arrogant, is not demeaning to the people involved. That's got to be a part of how we tackle the effects of climate change. That how do you get people to get rid of standing water in an empty flower pot in their yard or other places that you could be breeding mosquitoes? So we've always had mosquitoes. Yeah, but the mosquitoes that you always had were not the ones that are carrying dengue fever, which have moved further north in this, or forest protection. Kind of, we're joking with a Canadian friend early on in the climate. I said, the good news is you're going to be the breadbasket for the world. As it warms, you're going to be growing grain way up into northern. The bad news is the pine beetles are going to eat all your forests, because the pine beetles that have moved through Colorado up into Wyoming and Montana and just devastate in new forests. And you can't go out and whack them one at a time. You have to have biological procedures to deal with them, or spraying, and then how do you deal with the effects of spraying? These things, we can't do it without the ordinary people in most of the other countries. Absolutely have to have them. For us in the United States, it's Central America. It's not far away. It's 100 miles, which, if you had a bird carrying a seed from a problem plant, 100 miles is nothing in there. So we just have to do a better job of appreciating how interdependent we are as people, not just as institutions. So thank you for that question. Lou?
Thank you, Tom. Two-part question. First of all, has NOAA, NOAA, trashed its historical data? That's number one. Number two, and if so, how does that affect the international discussion?
I don't know if NOAA has trashed its data. I doubt it. I doubt that you can. I mean, stuff is redundant in so many, it doubtless still exists somewhere. But as I discovered earlier today, I wanted to take another look at my testimony for Congress in 2008. And I went to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence website, where this has lived for almost 20 years. It's gone. Everything before 2021 is gone. Now, it's someplace, and it's lots of places. I managed to find it in there. But if that's illustrative of the extent of rewriting history, getting rid of things that don't fit the fad du jour for what is acceptable, that's disastrous. That's disastrous, because the ability to learn from past mistakes as well as from past, got it mostly right, kind of things is just essential for dealing with hard problems. Does it make a difference? Is it does, in my judgment, that you don't want to go back to square one unless you really have to. That standing on the shoulders of people who've gone before, what are the questions they ask? Where did they get stuck? Because the data they needed just wasn't available. Yet another of my National Academies projects, we tried to figure out the smallest number of indicators that we could use as proxies for all of the other things we wanted to know, thought we needed to know in order to manage the effects of climate change. What are the 5 or 6 things that get you most of the way to understanding? Because expecting the world to collect data on 20 variables, weekly, monthly, it's just unrealistic. And even if you got it, most of it's going to be made up because it's too hard to do. But that's a necessary step. Being able to come at that, saying, what have people tried to do previously? A lot of smart people have wrestled with a lot of hard questions for a long time. And I must be best because I'm the latest one to tackle this problem. Anybody that's really tackled the problem knows that doesn't get you very far. It's just arrogant. Any questions, other questions in the room? Yes. Patty, I can't see. I can't say.
I just wanted to make a comment about Maui.
Mhm.
When you talk about how water gets diverted when you put up a wall, it's gotten now to where the water is coming up to a lot of the shorefront places that are out there. And just 2 resorts north of us, the county has refused to let them redo the wall that has kept the ocean out. And their oceanfront buildings are now condemned.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of making decisions. And what they're deciding is that the ocean should be allowed to do what it's going to do. And if your house is in the way, that's too bad.
Yeah.
And that's just shocking to me. It seems like when people were allowed to put their property where it's at, then they should also be allowed to protect it.
It's a good example of the question was using Maui as an example where the government is not allowing the rebuilding of a restraining wall for the ocean, and therefore the properties that are adjacent that are at risk are now condemned. That there's a learning curve with everything. And saying, oh, we know now we shouldn't have done that back then, but you've got a lot of investment, you got a lot of personal lives that are wrapped up in the places that they have gone. But the kind of choices that I think need to be teed up, just sticking with that example, of which I know nothing except what you just said, that to rebuild that wall is going to take money. Could that money be used to indemnify the people whose property has plunged in value from millions of dollars to nothing, because it's soon going to be a part of an aquarium. There'll be fish swimming through the bedroom. That are the amounts of money commensurate? Probably not. But that's the kind of thinking that I think we need to go, however we come out, and however each locality comes out on this, that simply, rebuilding the houses on the Outer Banks of North Carolina that get swept away every 4 or 5 years, because we can do it, doesn't mean it's smart. But people have invested money, time, personal history in these things. And how do we compensate? How do we balance? How do we factor that in? The default almost always is inertia. Maybe there won't be another hurricane. Maybe there won't be another fire. Maybe it won't be for a long time. I want to take the chance. Well, you might be willing to take the chance, but your next door neighbor might have a different calculation and say, I want out of here. If I could afford to move someplace else, I would do it. What's the role for government in that? I think probably some role is appropriate. Lou, do you have any others online?
I have a comment and a question. First of all, with respect to the prior question about NOAA data, it is believed that it is backed up in many big data sites, Amazon Web Service, and also places. And this is from Bob, who stays in touch with NOAA Climate and other branches at Boulder every couple of weeks. So that's good news. Now,
Yeah.
here is the comment and then a question. The current administration contains some smart, well-educated people. Why are they not persuaded by what they see and hear regarding climate change? Don't they realize they are dooming the world and their own grandchildren? Would you like me to repeat that?
No, I've got the question. What I don't have is an answer,
Okay.
because I don't understand it. I mean, I'm enough of an empiricist, political science, but influenced by scientific method, and evidence matters, and alternate facts is a nonsensical idea to me. If it's a fact, it's a fact. If it's not, it's an opinion. And everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And I don't understand, I just don't understand how people who should act differently don't act differently, in my perspective, don't act responsibly. That the standing up for what's right is, to me, a key part of public service. If you're going to acquiesce to things you know are wrong or don't make sense or need to be challenged, you're not acting responsibly, in my judgment. And we've had this sudden collapse of integrity and responsibility. It's easier to attribute it to political contributions and wanting to stay in office more than to do the right thing. I don't know. To me, it's probably right, but partial. It's too simple. The world is a complicated one. I hold out the hope that people will have a change of heart, or they begin to be affected by the kind of phenomenon that Patty pointed to. Somebody they know is going to be affected in a way that the householders in Maui were. Then it'll be personal. And the personal examples that are make you yawn when politicians refer to somebody they met and their private story. My experience, they actually have a real impact on thinking. In the abstract, this is a problem. It's very different than saying, my cousin. became ill with a disease that was not present in this location ever before. Crops that we planted here for generations don't grow to the same height or number of grains per husk or whatever it is. Then it's real. The climate arguments have been around morality. I mean, I applaud the young Swedish girl and her activism and all of that, but shaming people is not a very effective way to get them to do things on there. They've got to see a positive. If I do this, then we can accomplish that. Anything else in here? Penelope?
I think,
Need to use the microphone.
like that?
Yep.
Okay. I am aware of the fact that there's just so much fear going around. He looks like he's going to do this. What if, this is going to happen? If he does this, this is going to happen. And to me, that's what they want. And the way I look at it is, we survived Trump's first 4 years. We're going to do the second one too. And one of the things that gives me hope is some of these organizations like Earth Justice.
Mhm.
And Earth Justice has filed many lawsuits against Trump in the first administration, having to do with this drill baby drill nonsense.
Mhm.
And they won 85% of them. And I love this. In the Earth Justice magazine, there was a printout. It showed the top, the background. It sort of it showed a Trump, and it said he's planning all of this kind of thing again, and he's ready to act. And then below that, there was a candle, and underneath it, it said, "We're ready."
Mhm.
To me, that's the kind of hope we need. And we need to hang on to it.
I agree. There's got to be a people up tackling of these problems. And let's end on that optimistic note. Thank everybody who tuned in on Zoom. Thank those of you who are here. It will be posted in a day or two. If you want to go over some of it again or tell other people they can look at it. Our speaker next week is Herb Lynn. Herb is a physicist at Stanford who spent much of his career at the National Academy of Sciences, and he's going to speak on AI and national security. So we're going to do it a little differently. We're going to do it as a dialogue with me pitching questions to Herb. But I think you'll find him and his presentation very worthwhile. Lou, do you have anything else for us?
No, that's it. Thank you very much, Tom. I am going to stop the recording and then stop the meeting. Good night, everybody.
Good night, folks.
And thank you again, Tom.